Before we delve into this gripping narrative, please share in the comments where you're tuning in from to experience this poignant tale. The night everything changed. It was a cold evening, the kind that made the windows rattle and the wind howl through the trees like a whispering ghost. I was sitting at the kitchen table, pushing my food around my plate, lost in my thoughts. My mother sat across from me, tired eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight, lost in her own world. Dinner had been quiet, too quiet. Ever since Dad left, silence had become a familiar guest at our table. It filled the gaps where laughter and conversation used to live. My mother, once so full of life, had become a shadow of herself. She worked long hours, came home exhausted, and did her best to hold everything together. But we both knew things were falling apart. My older brother, Daniel, had been restless for weeks. He was 17, stubborn, and always seemed like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Lately, he had been spending less time at home, staying out late, arguing with Mom whenever he was around. I could see the frustration in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He wanted more freedom, more control, more than what our little life had to offer. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did, but I chose to ignore it. That night, after I cleared the dishes, I went to my room and pulled out my journal. Writing had always been my escape, my way of making sense of the chaos around me. I was about to put pen to paper when I heard a rustling sound outside my door. Curious, I stood up and peeked through the small gap. My heart skipped a beat. Daniel was in the hallway, dressed in his favorite hoodie and worn-out sneakers, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He moved quickly, quietly, like someone trying to avoid being caught. Something in my chest tightened. "Daniel." My voice barely rose above a whisper. He froze, his hand gripping the doorknob. For a moment, he didn't turn around. He just stood there, as if he was debating whether to acknowledge me or keep going. Then, with a sigh, he turned. "Hey, kid," he said, forcing a smile. "Go back to sleep." I stepped out of my room, my heart pounding. "Where are you going?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Out." It wasn't just out. I could see it in his face. This was different. Panic settled in my stomach like a heavy stone. "You're not coming back, are you?" Daniel looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, my necklace. The one Dad gave me on my 10th birthday. My eyes widened. "Daniel, that's mine." "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I needed some cash." It wasn't just the necklace. When I glanced down the hallway, I noticed my bedroom door was slightly open. My stomach turned. I pushed past him and ran into my room. The small jewelry box on my desk was open, its contents scattered. My savings jar, where I had been collecting money for months, was missing. Anger and betrayal surged through me like wildfire. "You stole from me," my voice cracked. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face hardening. "I didn't have a choice." "Yes, you did," I snapped, tears stinging my eyes. "You could have asked for help. You could have talked to Mom. You didn't have to do this." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I can't stay here, okay? I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I need to get out." I shook my head, fists clenched. "So, you're just gonna run? Leave me and Mom behind? You think that's gonna fix anything?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't expect you to understand." I took a step closer, my voice trembling. "Then make me understand." For the first time, his facade cracked. His eyes, usually so guarded, glistened with something raw and painful. "I'm drowning here," he whispered. "I can't breathe. Every day feels the same, like I'm stuck in a life that isn't mine. Mom's trying, but we're barely getting by. I can't stay and watch her struggle. I can't stay and feel helpless." My anger faltered. I wanted to tell him that we were in this together, that running wouldn't change the past or the pain we carried. But I also saw something in him, a desperation so deep that no words could fix it. Before I could say anything, we heard footsteps. Mom. Her tired voice cut through the hallway. What's going on? Daniel, and I turned to see her standing there, eyes flickering between us. When she saw the duffel bag in his hand, her face paled. Daniel. Her voice wavered. Silence hung between us like a heavy fog. Then, before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. He's leaving. Mom's breath hitched. What? Daniel looked away, his grip tightening on the bag. I need to go. Mom took a step forward, her hands shaking. Go where? Daniel, please. I can't do this anymore, he interrupted, his voice breaking. I love you, but I can't stay. Tears welled in Mom's eyes. We need you. Daniel clenched his jaw. I need to figure things out on my own. I watched as my mother's expression crumbled. She had already lost so much. Dad, the stability of our home, and now this. She reached out, but Daniel took a step back. I'm sorry, he whispered. And then, before either of us could stop him, he turned and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind him felt like the sharpest kind of goodbye. I stood frozen, watching as Mom collapsed into the nearest chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I should have run after him. I should have screamed for him to stay. But I didn't, because deep down I knew. He was already gone. The echoes of an empty room. I never knew how loud silence could be until Daniel was gone. It was the little things that made the absence unbearable. The way his bedroom door, once slightly ajar with music leaking through the cracks, now remained shut like a tombstone marking his departure. The way the house, already too quiet since Dad left, now felt hollow, like a shell of something that used to be full of life. And Mom, she was the worst of all. Not because she was angry, not because she lashed out, but because she didn't. She didn't say much at all. The morning after Daniel left, I found her in the kitchen, staring at her coffee cup like she was waiting for it to tell her what to do next. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Finally, I took a deep breath and forced the words out. Did you sleep? She didn't look up, just gave a small shake of her head. Neither had I. I sat across from her, tracing the pattern of the worn-out tablecloth with my fingers. He took my money, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom flinched like I had struck her. It was true, but it felt wrong to say it out loud, like it made everything worse. She exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. He'll be back. The way she said it, the way she forced herself to believe it, it broke something in me. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't so sure. That Daniel didn't just leave. He escaped. He had been planning this for a while. He didn't just take his things. He took pieces of us with him. But I couldn't bring myself to say that. So I nodded, letting her hold on to that last thread of hope. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the void he had left behind. His absence clung to the house like a stubborn shadow. Every time my mind wandered, I found myself expecting to hear his voice, his footsteps in the hallway, his dumb jokes about how I always burned the toast. But the only thing that greeted me was silence. By the time the sun started setting, I couldn't take it anymore. I found myself standing outside his bedroom door, my hand hovering over the handle. It felt wrong, invading his space, but I needed to understand. I needed to know if there was something I missed, some sign that could have told me he was slipping away before it was too late. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell, faint traces of his cologne, the kind he always put on too much of. It was like stepping into a memory. His room was messier than usual, like he had left in a hurry. His closet was half empty, drawers pulled open, as if he had taken what he needed and discarded the rest. But it wasn't just his things that were missing. The posters he had been collecting since middle school, the ones he had carefully arranged on the walls, were gone. His favorite books, the ones he used to reread even though he pretended he didn't care about them, were missing from the shelf. It was like he had erased himself. My throat tightened. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A small piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden under his pillow. With shaky fingers, I reached for it. It wasn't a letter. Not exactly. Just a few scribbled lines, like he had written it in a hurry and never finished. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to do this. I can't stay. I love you both, but I can't keep pretending I belong here. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I have to find something. Something more. Please don't hate me." I read it over and over, my hands trembling. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not quiet tears, not the kind you wipe away before anyone can see. No, I sobbed, the kind that shakes your whole body, the kind that forces out all the pain you've been holding in. I hated him. I missed him. I wanted to scream at him and hug him all at once. He was my brother, my best friend. And now he was just gone. The days passed in a blur. Mom threw herself into work, staying late at the diner, picking up extra shifts. She avoided Daniel's room, avoided talking about him, as if ignoring the problem would make it disappear. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just sit here while my brother was out there, alone, with no idea where he was going. So I did the only thing I could think of. I searched for him. It started small, checking the places he used to hang out, asking his friends if they had heard from him. Most of them just shrugged, said they hadn't seen him in days. Some said he had been talking about leaving for a while, but they never thought he'd actually do it. I widened my search, going to the bus station, the skate park, even the rundown corner store he used to buy energy drinks from late at night. Nothing. Days turned into a week. And then, one afternoon, I got a lead. I was sitting outside the library, scrolling through my phone, when I got a message from one of Daniel's old friends. "Saw your brother yesterday. Looked rough. Think he was heading toward East Side." My heart nearly stopped. East Side. It wasn't the safest part of town. If Daniel was there, it meant he was either desperate or in trouble. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat and ran. The streets of East Side were nothing like home. The buildings were old and crumbling, the sidewalks cracked and littered with cigarette butts. People loitered on the corners, watching with tired eyes as I passed. I felt out of place, vulnerable. But I wasn't leaving without my brother. I searched for hours, checking alleyways, abandoned lots, anywhere someone might crash if they had nowhere else to go. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw him. He was sitting on the steps of an old building, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken. He looked exhausted, defeated. For a second, I just stood there, my heart in my throat. Then I took a deep breath and walked toward him. He didn't look up until I was right in front of him. His eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing here?" I crossed my arms. "I should be asking you that." He let out a tired laugh, rubbing his hands over his face. "You shouldn't have come." "Too bad," I shot back. "You don't get to just disappear." His expression darkened. I didn't have a choice. "Yes, you did," I countered. "And you made the wrong one." Silence. Then, finally, he looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the first time since he left, I saw it. Regret. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know how to fix this." I stepped forward, my voice softer now. "Come home." He hesitated. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled note I had found in his room. "I know why you left," I said, my voice shaking. "But running isn't the answer. We can figure this out, together." Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. And for the first time since that night, I saw something shift in him. Hope. The weight of coming home. It was strange how, after everything, it was the silence between us that felt heavier than any words. Daniel and I sat side by side on the curb, the streetlights above us flickering weakly, as if they too were exhausted from trying to keep up with the night. The streets of Eastside smelled of gasoline and burnt-out dreams, a place where people came to disappear. For the longest time, neither of us spoke. I wanted to tell him how much I hated him for leaving, how angry I was that he stole from me, how selfish it was to disappear without a single thought about how it would tear Mom apart. But when I finally found my voice, none of those words came out. Instead, I whispered, "Are you hungry?" Daniel let out a tired chuckle, shaking his head. "You always do that." I frowned. "Do what?" He turned to look at me, his eyes dull with exhaustion. "You always ask me dumb things when you don't know what else to say." I opened my mouth to argue, but he wasn't wrong. When we were kids, I'd ask him about his favorite superhero when he scraped his knee. I'd ask what color the sky was when Mom and Dad were fighting in the other room. I'd ask him if he liked chocolate or vanilla when I knew he wasn't okay. Because sometimes the right words didn't exist. Sometimes all you could do was remind someone that they weren't alone. He ran a hand through his messy hair, exhaling shakily. "Yeah, I'm hungry." That single admission felt like the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. I stood up, brushing dirt off my jeans. "Come on." Daniel hesitated, glancing down the street, like he was debating whether or not to run. I held my breath, afraid he'd disappear again, that I'd blink, and he'd be gone. But then, finally, he stood. We ended up at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, the kind of place with sticky booths and waitresses who looked like they had seen it all. Daniel slumped into the seat across from me, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked thinner, like he hadn't eaten a real meal in days. I didn't push him to talk. Instead, I ordered 2 burgers, extra fries, and 2 chocolate milkshakes. He raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you drink milkshakes?" "Since now," I said flatly. "Shut up and eat." He smirked but didn't argue. For the first few minutes, we just ate. Daniel devoured his food like a starving man, barely pausing to breathe. I let him, watching quietly as he cleaned his plate before I had even taken more than a few bites of my own. Then finally I asked, "Where have you been?" Daniel sighed, leaning back against the booth. "Around." I shot him a look. That's not an answer. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in his bones. "I've been staying at some guy's place, a friend of a friend. It's not great, but it's a roof." I swallowed hard. "Daniel, you..." "I know." He cut me off. "I know it was stupid. He shook his head. "I didn't think it through." For the first time, his voice cracked. I set my burger down, suddenly not hungry anymore. "Why didn't you come back?" His fingers curled around his milkshake, gripping it like it was the only thing holding him together. "Because I didn't think you'd want me to." I blinked. "What?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I stole from you, from Mom. I ran away in the middle of the night like some coward. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me." A lump formed in my throat. "Daniel." "I thought I could do it," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could make it on my own. But I was wrong. And by the time I realized that, it felt too late." I stared at him, my heart aching. My brother, this stubborn, reckless, infuriating person, looked small for the first time in my life. I reached across the table and grabbed his wrist. "It's not too late." He finally met my gaze, his eyes full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. We left the diner just as the sky started to lighten, a soft pink hue bleeding into the dark. Neither of us spoke as we walked back toward the bus station. Daniel kept his hand stuffed into his hoodie pocket, his steps slow and hesitant, like he was still unsure if he was making the right choice. When we reached the station, I stopped and turned to him. "Are you ready?" He let out a breath. "I don't know." I nodded, understanding. It wasn't going to be easy. Coming home meant facing Mom. It meant dealing with the damage he had left behind. It meant rebuilding trust, proving that he wasn't just going to disappear again. but he was here. And that was a start. As we stepped onto the bus, I glanced over at him. "Hey." He raised an eyebrow. "What?" I smirked. "I forgive you." Daniel blinked, surprised. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Thanks, kid." The bus pulled away, carrying us home. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The long road back. The morning sun spilled through the bus windows, painting streaks of gold across Daniel's tired face. He had fallen asleep halfway through the ride, his head resting against the rattling glass. For the first time in what felt like forever, he looked at peace, his expression soft, almost like the kid I used to know. I wished I could hold on to that moment. Because deep down, I knew the hardest part wasn't finding him. It was bringing him back. By the time we stepped off the bus in our neighborhood, reality settled in like an anchor around my chest. Daniel hesitated at the curb, hands stuffed into his hoodie, eyes darting toward the street like he was still debating whether to run. I nudged him with my elbow. "You keep looking at that road like you're about to make a break for it." His lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking." I folded my arms. "Thinking about what?" He let out a breath, his gaze locked on the familiar houses lining our street. What if she doesn't want me back? The question hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't have an answer. Because honestly, I didn't know. Mom had been through too much. First, Dad leaving. Then, trying to keep everything together, while Daniel spiraled further and further away. His disappearance had nearly broken her. Would she be able to forgive him? Would she even want to? I reached out and grabbed his wrist, forcing him to look at me. "She's our mom, Daniel. She'll always want you back." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, even after everything. I softened. That's the thing about moms. They don't stop loving you just because you screw up. He exhaled shakily. Then, slowly, he nodded. Together, we walked up the driveway. The front door felt heavier than usual as I pushed it open. The house was eerily still, the kind of silence that filled spaces where something had been missing for too long. "Mom," I called out, stepping inside. No answer. Daniel shifted beside me, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's probably at work." I frowned. Mom never worked Sundays. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I turned toward the kitchen, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting at the table, staring at a steaming mug of coffee. She hadn't noticed us yet, lost in whatever thoughts weighed her down. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair slightly messy, like she had been up all night. I stepped forward first, clearing my throat. "Mom." Her head snapped up. The moment she saw Daniel, she froze. I held my breath. The room felt too small, too charged with something I couldn't name. For a long time, she just looked at him, taking in the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hoodie hung loosely off his frame, the weight of exhaustion in his posture. Then, without a word, she stood. Daniel flinched like he expected her to yell, to break, to do something, anything that would match the storm in her eyes. Instead, she crossed the room and pulled him into the tightest hug I had ever seen. Daniel stiffened for half a second before his arms wrapped around her, his fingers gripping her sweater like a lifeline. I blinked, my throat tightening as I watched them. Mom's voice trembled against his shoulder. "You stupid, stupid boy." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "I know." She pulled back just enough to cup his face, her fingers pressing into his cheeks, like she was trying to make sure he was real. "Don't you ever do that to me again, do you hear me?" His voice cracked. "I won't." She exhaled, resting her forehead against his. "I thought I lost you." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry, Mom." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the old kitchen clock ticking against the wall. Then Mom let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. "I don't care how old you get. You are never too big for me to ground you." Daniel let out a half laugh, half sob. I figured. And just like that, the pieces of our broken family began to stitch themselves back together. The rest of the day passed in a blur of awkward conversations and unspoken apologies. Mom didn't push too hard. She didn't ask for details about where he had been or what he had done. Not yet. Instead, she did the one thing Daniel needed most. She let him be home. She made his favorite meal, grilled cheese with tomato soup, just like she used to when we were kids. She fussed over him, making him take a shower, change into clean clothes, and sit at the table like he hadn't been gone for weeks. I caught him glancing around the house more than once, like he was trying to remember what home felt like. At one point, while Mom was in the kitchen, he leaned over to me and whispered, "Why is she being so normal?" I shrugged. "Because she's Mom." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't deserve this." I met his gaze. "Maybe not, but you're still getting it." He fell silent, absorbing that. Because that was the thing about love. You didn't have to deserve it. You just had to accept it. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a soft knock on my door. Yeah. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped inside. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can I, sit?" I raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you ask?" He rolled his eyes but dropped onto the edge of my bed. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he spoke. "I owe you an explanation." I shifted, turning onto my side. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted. I stayed quiet, waiting. He exhaled, staring at the floor. "I didn't leave because I hated you or Mom. I left because I hated me." I swallowed hard. I felt stuck, he continued. Like I was suffocating. Dad left, and suddenly, I had to be the man of the house. But I didn't even know who I was. I was angry all the time. At him, at myself, at everything. And I thought maybe, if I just left, I could figure it out. His voice wavered, but all I figured out was how lost I really was. I sat up, hugging my knees to my chest. "Daniel." He rubbed his eyes, his exhaustion deeper than just sleepless nights. I thought running would make me free. But it didn't. It just made me realize how much I needed to come back. Silence stretched between us. Then, I whispered, "I'm glad you did." Daniel let out a breath, nodding. For the first time in a long time, I saw something in his eyes that had been missing for years. Peace. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I knew things weren't magically fixed. There were still conversations to be had, trust to rebuild, wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But for the first time since Daniel left, I believed we had a chance. And sometimes that was enough. The things we carry. The days that followed weren't a fairy tale. They weren't a perfect reunion, wrapped up neatly with a bow. They were messy. They were full of long conversations that started and stopped, apologies that lingered in the air but weren't always spoken, and moments of hesitation where we all questioned if we could truly put the pieces back together. But they were also full of something else. Effort. Daniel tried. In ways I never expected, he tried. He stayed home. He didn't vanish at night like a ghost slipping through the cracks. He ate dinner with us, even when the silence at the table felt too heavy to bear. And Mom, she tried too. She didn't push too hard, didn't ask too many questions at once. But I caught her sometimes, just watching him, her fingers trembling around the edges of her coffee cup, like she was afraid that if she blinked, he'd disappear again. And then there was me. I wanted to believe things could go back to the way they were before he left. But the truth was, they couldn't. Too much had changed. We had all changed. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. One evening, about a week after Daniel came home, I found him in the garage. It was late, the kind of night where the world felt soft and quiet, where the hum of the streetlights blended with the crickets outside. He was sitting on the old workbench, a dusty shoebox in his lap. I leaned against the doorway. You planning on running away again? Or? Daniel smirked, but it was weak. Not this time. I stepped inside, brushing off a chair before sitting across from him. What's that? He hesitated, then opened the box. Inside were scraps of our childhood, things I had almost forgotten existed. A baseball card with a bent corner. A plastic ring from the arcade we used to beg Dad to take us to. A wrinkled drawing of a spaceship we made together when we were kids. The words "Daniel and me against the universe" scribbled in the corner in my messy handwriting. My throat tightened. I picked up the drawing, running my fingers over the faded lines. I forgot about this. Daniel exhaled, staring down at it. I didn't. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something quiet and unspoken. I glanced at him. Why'd you keep this stuff? He shrugged. I don't know. Guess I just needed a reminder. A reminder of what? He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper, that I belonged somewhere. I looked at him then, really looked at him. My brother, the one who had always acted like he had everything figured out, like nothing could touch him, was finally letting me see the cracks in his armor. And in that moment, I realized something. Daniel never ran away because he didn't love us. He ran because he was afraid he wasn't enough. I reached out and gave his wrist a small squeeze. You didn't have to leave to figure that out, you know. He let out a shaky breath. I know that now. And somehow, I believed him. The next morning, Daniel came into the kitchen with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. For a split second, my heart stopped. I stiffened. Where are you going? Mom, who had been pouring coffee, froze mid-motion, her fingers tightening around the handle. Daniel looked between us, then let out a soft chuckle. Relax. I'm not running this time. I narrowed my eyes. Then what's with the bag? He set it down and unzipped it, pulling out a stack of books. I went to the community center yesterday. They've got GED prep classes. My heart stuttered. Mom's lips parted slightly. You're going back to school. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Figured it's time to stop running and actually start doing something. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then Mom took a deep breath, walked over, and wrapped her arms around him. She didn't say anything, just held him, the way only a mother could. Daniel let out a soft chuckle. Mom, you're squishing me. She sniffled, pulling back, her hands still on his shoulders. I don't care. I'm proud of you. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, and this time, he didn't look away. That night, I found another note in my room. Not crumpled, not rushed. Neatly folded, placed right on my pillow. I opened it with shaking hands. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Thank you for finding me when I didn't know how to find myself. It's still you and me against the universe. Daniel. A tear slipped down my cheek. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had lost my brother. I had finally found him again. And this time, I knew he wasn't going anywhere.